One thing that the global COVID-19 pandemic certainly did bring for people, institutions and businesses was uncertainty. As work conditions flash changed, sometimes overnight, HR departments did their best to buffer the uncertainty away, sometimes to the detriment to their own overall well-being. And what do managers do when they perceive that the legal system is uncertain? One stream of research shows that they embrace contingent work and turn to relations rather than contracts to safeguard their interests and avoid risks. And the risks in turbulent times are substantial, like being locked in a partnership that is not useful anymore and collapse under its weight. Another stream shows that when conditions are uncertain and negative, firms often downsize, internalize all HR activities, and avoid employing contractors or relying on partnerships in order to remove risks. Some researchers suggest that companies empower workers more, as empowerment brings more value than when uncertainty is low. Besides the fact that this knowledge is not conclusive, it is constructed based on the Western developed context, which does not make that much sense, given that non-Western developing countries suffer from much more uncertainty. It is in this nexus that we have set to investigate the research question: how do legal uncertainties impact HR practices in developing countries? We had in mind that knowing this could be really handy for the firms that need to define their HR strategies during crisis, especially in the turbulent world we face today. To this end, we turned to a different developing country than existing research, namely to Kazakhstan. There, we examined the case of a producer of technical gases. Our data included field notes and expert interviews with company executives following 2020 health crisis. We uncovered which kinds of legal uncertainties this crisis produced, which HR practices were impacted, and how HR experts, whose activity is critical for the health of the country's population, adapted existing practices to these uncertainties. Our main finding was that the inadequate legislation, tight norms, and low degree of enforcement during the COVID-19 pandemic made it difficult to change existing HR practices and develop new ones. So much for the earlier promise of flexibility. And worse, because the company's position was so critical for fighting with the crisis as it produced and delivered oxygen, and because the laws were so difficult to enforce in pandemic turmoil, it fell on the shoulders of regular HR employees to make the toughest decisions. Certainly, extant literature would have called it empowerment and congratulated the top management for giving them autonomy. And in a normal, day-to-day life, that would be it. However, in this critical time, these people, who themselves were tired, overworked, worried about the health of their close ones, perhaps also sick, had to decide who gets the oxygen, a hospital or a wealthy international corporate client whose money keeps the company afloat. Or should they allow remote work to their personnel, going against the existing legal regulations and risking a massive fine or even more? In addition to the moral weight, further legal responsibility for these decisions also landed on their shoulders, often without visibility into the strategic and legal dynamic around the questions they needed to ponder. This contrast between empowerment and responsibilization were important in our view and led us to theorize that the main distinction between the two concepts was the risk of negative legal consequences associated with active decision-making during crisis. This study makes three important contributions to the status quo knowledge on the impact of uncertainty on HR practices. First, it contributes to the knowledge of the impacts of uncertainty in developing countries by showing how legal inadequacy during a crisis makes HR practices less flexible. Second, it allows the empirical examination of several key theoretical debates on the impact of uncertainty on HR practices. Finally, it calls for a critical take on the idea of empowerment during uncertainty, showing how the burden of difficult and dangerous decisions shifts to individual HR managers in times of uncertainty.